good evening. Today we would start our class on sampling techniques. Just give me a moment as I share the slides. I think by the end of my classes, I'll hand over all the slides to your, I think, Tapan sir, and he can share it in the group. I think that works for all.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so we'll be discussing about sampling and the different types of sampling today. I guess you are aware of this concept called sampling. Normally, you choose few items as a part of your study since it is not possible always to cover the entire universe or the entire population, and we call it a sample. So, we will go into the details of it in today's class because when we are talking about research design, sampling design is a part of it, and no research design can be complete without talking about the samples and the sample size. So basically, a sample is a subset of the population the researcher actually examines to gather the data. So sample is population of the entire group. It tries to represent the group. The collected data on sample aims at gaining information on the entire population. And what is the population? The population is the entire group of subjects the researcher wants information on. Suppose you would say that you want to have a study on the different regional centers of IGNO. So, what makes your population? Can anyone answer? Suppose you are talking about all the RC groups, your regional centers of IGNO, where these counseling classes take place. That's the universe. So, perhaps all the regional centers of India, there could be many. I really am not aware of the numbers. That constitutes the sample for you. Sorry, that constitutes the population for you. That's the entire universe on your part. And say from all the regional centers in India, you choose some of the regional centers, say from North India, from South India. You pick up two, any two from North India, from South India, from East India, from West India, because it is not possible. You have limited time, you have limited resources, and it is not possible on your part to cover the entire RCs across the country. So the there are two RCs that you have selected from each zone constitutes your sample, and the entire RC across the country constitutes your population. You have to be aware of these little concepts when we are talking about sampling. Then there is another concept, and you may not find it in your book with the same clarity. So the another concept is sampling frame. What is a sampling frame? It consists of all units from which the sample will be drawn. So ideally, the sample frame should be identical to the population, or at least it should closely resemble it. So, for example, if I say that I am trying to have a study on a particular classroom, say your MA first year classroom in Bhubaneswar. And what makes the sampling frame? Now, the sampling frame represents all the units in the population or the universe. That means the attendance register that I have, it, it makes the sampling frame. So the attendance register actually has the list of all the students enrolled in this batch. So maybe say there are 100 students enrolled, and out of them I am trying to conduct a study on 10 at least. So those 10 constitute my sample, 100 is my universe, and my attendance register comprises of my sampling frame. Got it? So first, the concept that you will be using is sample. Sample is a subset of the population. Sample is that those selected elements that you pick up for your study from the entire population. Sampling unit is a single member of the sample. Sampling is a process of selecting an adequate number of elements from the population so that the study of the sample will not only help in understanding the characteristics of the population but will also generalize the result. So just look at this concept. One is sample, second is sampling unit, is a single member of the sample. Sampling process is the process of selecting the sample for your study. Census, what happens in a census? In a census, you tend to examine every element of the population. So basically, in census, you are taking 100%, your sample size is 100% of the population. So there is no difference between your sample and your universe or your population. Got it? So this is a diagrammatic representation of the population of the universe, and you select a small number for your study that constitutes your sample size. So, why is it necessary to use sampling? Firstly, you will see that literally it is not possible to cover the entire population. You neither have that much of time. Say, I'm trying to conduct a study in Odisha. So Odisha has 30 districts, it has so many blocks, and it has so many population. I cannot go to each household and knock it out there at their door and try and collect data. So for that, when the universe is quite vast, I will try to pick up my sample so that the sample represents the entire universe. Say out of 30 districts, I have chosen, say, 5 districts. Maybe I have equally distributed from north, south, east, west, or I have made categories of tribal and non-tribal districts. There has to be some logic that needs to be followed. So what you will see that in many cases a complete coverage of the population is not possible. There is effectiveness when you use sampling, because since complete coverage may not offer substantial advantage over a sample survey, sampling provides better options in a short period of time as it produces comparable and valid results. So, you may go on and on with a particular study if you tend to have a complete coverage. That's the reason why we take up this census study once in a decade. The reason being that it takes so much of time and so many resources. It's about, so much of manpower is required, so much of resource and time is required when you are talking about census, because they are going to cover each and every unit of the population. So when it when you talk about the census, your sample size is 100% of the universe, and it is not always possible, and it will not produce comparable and valid results. That's the reason why we go for sampling technique. There is economy of time. Studies based on samples produce quick results in less time. So instead of covering the entire population, I can just have a model that can be used for comparison, and for that I can use fewer samples, which could be generalized on the entire population. There is economy of labor. Sampling is less demanding in terms of labor requirements since it covers only a small portion of the target population. There is overall economy. Sampling is thought to be more economical as it involves fewer people and requires less printed material, fewer general cost in terms of traveling and accommodation, of course, fewer experts. So there is economy of time, economy of labor, and it is less expensive. And when you choose a sample, you go into the details. You can afford to ask them the detail, and you can have an in-depth study. But if you wish to cover the entire universe, you would always be in a hurry. You will never afford the time, and the quality of research would also be hampered. So samples are thought to offer more detailed information, higher degree of accuracy, and since they are relatively smaller units to be covered, that's the reason why efficiency level, when it comes to the sampling technique, is much higher than covering the entire universe. Then you have the principles of sampling. Sample unit must be chosen in a systematic and objective manner. You have to be extremely systematic, you have to be objective. You cannot be affected with any kind of prejudice or bias as to, suppose I will go and I need to cover some of the households for a particular survey. I cannot, afford to say that, okay, I know these people in this colony, so let me start with them. It doesn't happen like that. So you never look for convenience. You have to come out of your comfort zone, and you have to pick your samples very objectively. Then these sample units must be easily identifiable and clearly defined. Normally, whenever you pick up a sample, there shouldn't be any confusion. You are in a position where you can identify them easily, you can define them easily, you can provide the justification as to why did you select them. Sample units must be independent of each other, uniform and same size, should appear only once in the population. You cannot ask one single unit of a sample to be repeated again and again. It has to appear once in the population. No duplication or replication is can be afforded. Sample units are not interchangeable. Same units should be used throughout the study. Once selected, units cannot be discarded. Once I have selected my sample, I will not say that, this person is giving me a hard time, it's being so hot, I cannot cover this many areas. You cannot simply discard it. You have to do it. So that's the reason why it is said that whenever you choose a sample, you do it very reasonably. You try to look for the feasibility of it, and then you go about it. The selection process should be based on sound criteria and should avoid errors, biases, and distortions. Researchers should adhere to the principles of research here whenever you are talking of choosing a sample. As I told you earlier, you have to avoid all kinds of prejudices and biases when it comes to selecting a sample size. Uh, you know, Whenever we take up a study, normally there are the certain possibilities of those study being affected with two kinds of error. One is sampling error, and the other is non-sampling error. What is the sampling error? Uh, when I talk about sampling error, it arises when the sample is not representative of the population. Here I have given an example. We are trying to estimate the average height of students in the Department of Sociology, comprising of 200 students. We take a sample of 10 students. Let's assume that the true value of the population mean is known. We may find that the sample mean is far away from the population. So the difference between sample mean and population mean is called sampling error. There are 200 students, and out of those 200 students I have chosen 10 students. So say the sample, uh, the mean, if I try to calculate the mean value of these 200 students, it will come around, say, uh, 5 foot 4 inches. And now I randomly choose, I just arbitrarily choose 10 students in that classroom of 200, and I try to calculate their mean value of the heights, and the mean value comes to around, say, 5 foot 8 inches, which is, and you will find that there is so much of gap and difference between the mean value of the sample size and mean value of the population size, and that is what is called a sampling error. But apart from sampling error, you know there are different ways, different non-sampling errors that can affect your study. So basically, we have learned that sampling error is an outcome when of your sample not being representative of the population. Because why do you choose a sample? Because we assume that the sample is representative of the population. Just one of the very often repeated example of sample is when you tend to pick up one grain of rice from the rice pot while you are cooking rice. ଭାତ ହାଣ୍ଡିରୁ ଗୋଟେ ଭାତ ଆମେ ଚିପିକି ଦେଖୁଛେ ଯେ ଭାତଟା ହେଲାଣି କି ନାହିଁ. You do not go about picking up the entire bowl କି ଆଚ୍ଛା ଏଇ ଭାତଟା ବି ଦେଖିବି, ସେଇଟା ଦେଖିବି, ସବୁ ଚାଉଳ ଗୁଡ଼ାକ ଦେଖିବି. You don't do that. You will spoil the entire thing. So that's the reason why we choose this idea of sampling, where you pick up few units and you test that whether the same is applicable for the entire population. But if you don't choose your samples correctly, there lies your problem. If I say ki, I have poured few grains of rice into that rice pot, much later already ମୁଁ କିଛି ଚାଉଳ ପକେଇଛି and I have put it for cooking, ତାପରେ ମନେ ପଡ଼ିଲା ନା ନା ଭାତ ଟିକେ କମିଯିବ, ମୁଁ ତାପରେ ଆଉ ମୁଠାଏ ପକେଇ ଦେଉଛି. What do? I pick up the grains that I added later, and then I realize ki acha acha hai hi nahi. But at the end I would see that the rice I added later was actually undercooked, and the rice that was already there, it has been overcooked. So when I used the rice, that grains that I added later as my sample, it created a sampling error. So that's the kind of error we commit when it comes to sampling error. Now let's have a look at the different kinds of non-sampling errors. First, when respondents do not give you the correct answer. Non-sampling error, when does it appear? When you have identified some of the respondents for your study, and either that respondent is not interested, the respondent is quite bored with your questions, he or she tends to give you an incorrect answer to the questions that you have put forth. Second, error can arise while transferring data from questionnaire to the spreadsheet. When you are trying to transfer the data from the questionnaire and enter, so in the data entry process, you may omit or commit certain mistake that can be a reason of non-sampling error. Third, errors can occur at the time of coding, tabulation, and computation. If the population of the study is not clearly defined, if I do not have any idea on my universe, so I will not be in a position to calculate my entire sample size, because normally we tend to take a particular percentage of the universe. But I would say that, okay, let me know how many people in this city are Coke lovers, and how many people in the city are Pepsi lovers. I don't have any database for that. So I really don't have any idea. And in such a case, I might commit a non-sampling error, because since my universe has not been properly defined, I'm not in a position to clearly identify and define my sample size. So I can commit a non-sampling error in that case. The chosen respondents may not be available or choose not to be a part of the study. So right from the beginning, I have identified, few respondents for my sample, and I have followed a particular logic for identifying them. Uh, and But at the end of the study, while you are proceeding with your study, uh, you will see that those respondents turned hostile, and they said that they refused to be a part of the study. And as I told you earlier, that once a sample has been selected, it is very difficult to discard it. So because you are applying certain logic to select them, you have your own calculations that would damage your entire idea, the way you have imagined it. The entire design, sampling design, would get spoiled. So that could be one of the reasons for sampling error. Then another reason could be, there may be a, an error in the sampling frame. Basically, a sampling frame gives you an idea of the entire universe. So when it has been wrongly recorded, the list that is recorded in the sampling frame is itself wrong, your sample size would be wrong also. So that can also provide certain kind of error. Uh, could you give me an example of a sampling frame? Any of you? Suppose I would say that I need a sampling frame for the city of Bhubaneswar. What would be the sampling frame? Give me an example. A sampling frame for the population of people residing in Bhubaneswar city. Any one of you? No? Give it a try. It could be the voter list, isn't it? Because it's enumerated. The list of the voters, the people who are residing in the city of Bhubaneswar, mostly it is enumerated in the voter list. So the voters list would constitute the sampling frame in this case. So let's come to the idea on the types of sampling. There are two types of sampling. One is probability sampling, and the other is non-probability sampling. probability sampling, here each member of the population has an equal probability of being selected. The key point behind all probabilistic sampling approaches is random selection. The advantage of probability sampling is that sampling error can be calculated. So, most important, you have to keep in mind that each member has a equal and a known chance of being selected. Approaches are random sampling, and the advantage of probability sampling is that sampling error can be calculated easily. Then the other type of sampling that you mostly witness is non-probability sampling. Your members are selected from the population in some non-random manner, but at the same time you have certain logic. There is a rationale behind choosing those sample. It is not that you are just following your wish, or you are just going with the flow and picking up anybody randomly. No, that doesn't happen. In this method, the degree to which the sample differs from the population remains unknown. So, this is an example of random sampling. Here, each unit of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So, each unit, there is a yellow ball, there is a red ball, there is a green ball, there is a blue ball. Anything can be selected. It has an equal chance. Just think of a dice, a Ludo dice. Every unit from 1 to 6 has a known and equal chance of being selected. That is called probability sampling, and in probability sampling, the first form is random sampling. There are two different types of random sampling. First is simple random sampling with replacement. What do you do here? Normally, you follow lottery method. You list all elements of the population from where samples are to be drawn is prepared. So normally you write sleeps. Suppose there are some 100 students in my classroom, or say there are 1000 students in that classroom, and I write each of their names in a chit and put it in a box. So if there are 100 elements in the population, all those 100 elements are put on different sleeves. If we choose to take sample of 20 elements, we pick up one unit from the box, note it down, and again put it in the box. Suppose I pick up one name, I note down the name in a copy, and again I put the chit in the box. So here the probability of every element being chosen is 1 out of 1000, and the second element also has the same probability, that is 1 out of 1000. As I told you, imagine a dice. Every time you throw the dice, there is this probability of 1 by 6. That probability doesn't get diminished. Got it? The second type is simple random sampling without replacement. Here the procedure is same as followed in the previous design. What you do, you again pick up the names of each and every element present in that universe, write it down in a slip and put it in the box. This way the first unit would be selected with a probability of 1 by 1000. But In the previous case, you were putting the slip back into the box. This time you will put it away. You will not put it back in the box. So when you choose the second element, the probability of the second element being chosen is 1 by 999. The third element will have the probability of 1 by 198. The fourth element will have the probability of 1 by 197. So on. It will go like this. So this is what we call simple random sampling with without replacement. So simple random sampling with or without replacement is not mostly used in a consumer research, as it is difficult to prepare a sampling frame. So remember, the most important requirement for taking up simple random sampling is to construct a sampling frame. You always need a sampling frame, as I told you. That is the list of the entire universe. Unless you have a list, you cannot go for simple random sampling. It cannot be used and may not provide a representative sample in every case. For example, a locality has 10,000 households with 5,000 low income group, 3,500 middle, and the remaining 1,500 high income group. So, I would say that in such a scenario, I will try to use this lottery method with or without replacement to choose a sample of say 50. And I may not have a proper representation from each of the categories. Say the maximum households, they belong to the low income group, but somehow, because of this lottery income method, I got the maximum number of high households from the high income groups. So when I take their views, definitely I will land up having certain kind of biases, because my sample was not properly represented. So it will amount to sample sampling error. So what you will do that, in order to know avoid this kind of a sample error, we have to see that every sample that we select for this particular study is appropriately representing each of the three categories. It is proportionately representing. Since the lower income group have the maximum number of households, we need to see that when you are representing them, the maximum number of samples size should be drawn from them. Then the middle income group, which has the second most highest population, we tend to give priority to them, and then to the high income group, which has the least number as far as its size is concerned. Now, the other type of sampling that we use in probability sampling is called systematic sampling. So normally what you do here the entire population is arranged in order, either ascending or descending or alphabetical order. Say for example, here also I would need a sampling frame. It is very important. I cannot do without a sampling frame. So as I had told you earlier, suppose I'm trying to take up a study on a particular classroom. My sampling frame would be my attendance register. So I will try to put each of those sample units in an alphabetical order. Say I would take up, I'll start with all the names that starts with A, and alphabetically arrange them. So, and this is how I will go about. So first I will try to identify my sampling interval. What is sampling interval? Sampling interval is equal to the size of the population divided by the size of the sample. So say for example, uh, the size of my population is 100, and the size of my sample is 10. So 100 divided by 10 gives you 10. So a random, any random number is selected from 1 or any digit. Let We will call it C, and we will just, I will try to lay my hand on any of the names that is in the list. So say I started with a name starting with B. Then the next sample would start after 10 elements. I will count 10 elements down the list, and the 11th element would be my sample. That is how I will choose my second respondent. For the third respondent, I will again count another 10. I will have an interval of 10, and say the 20th element would be my sample. So that is how I will go on selecting my sample size till I have reached the 10th element, because I have chosen my sample size to be 10. Got it? So this can be representative as it would contain representations from every category. It may be noted that the first unit is selected at random. There is a chance thing here. We call it probability sampling design. And having chosen this, we do not have control over the subsequent units of the sample. We call it non-probability design. So that is the reason why we call systematic sampling mixed sampling, because it is a mix of both probability as well as non-probability sampling. Duplication is not a problem in this design, because you have seen that in simple random sampling with replacement, we were always, putting the slip back into the box. So sometimes it might happen that you will end up, picking up the same chit again and again. You will have this kind of problem with simple random sampling with replacement. So sorry, without replacement. So in this case, the idea of duplication would not bother you, and it may not require a complete sampling frame always, because mostly it is difficult to get a sampling frame. As I was, giving you this example, that I need to know the number of coke lovers in the city of Bhubaneswar. It's definitely not possible, because we don't have any database for that. You need to know the universe before conducting the survey. So I really do not know where what should be my sample size, because I don't have any idea on the size of my universe. Uh, Here you will see that an investigator may interview every 10th customer entering a mall. I will stand inside a mall, and I will, wait near that section where coke and all kinds of beverages are being sold, and I will wait for every 10th customer, and I will ask the 10th customer, what is your choice of drink? Is it Coke or Fanta or Pepsi? So at times there are chances of systematic bias creeping into the sample, resulting in non-representative sample. So there could be some bias, because I was standing on a particular day for this many hours, and in those time, during that duration, only Pepsi lovers turned up. But the moment I left the place, all the customers who went to that store, they actually got a bottle of Sprite instead. And at the end of the day, if you ask the shopkeeper, the shopkeeper said that he had sold out more Sprite bottles than Coke bottles. So there can be a systematic bias creeping in, which may result in non-representative sample in case of systematic sampling. That is one of the critiques that is provided for systematic sampling. The next is stratified random sampling. So, what do you do is in a stratified sampling, when you talk about a stratum, which is a subset of the population that shares at least one common characteristics. Examples of strata might be male, female, managers, non-managers. The categories could be different. So the basic idea of stratified sampling is to pick up, choose things from different categories. So here you can see fish. There is a green. There are green colored fish. There are blue. There are pink ones. So I see that the maximum number of fish are blue in color. So that's the reason I have chosen three fishes from the bucket of the entire bucket. Then the maximum, the second highest number is green in color. So I have taken two green ones. And the pink ones have the least population, and that's the reason I have chosen only one sample from that category. I hope I'm clear. Now, coming to the uh, details of stratified random sampling. So, whenever we talk about stratified random sampling, here the entire population is divided into strata or groups, which are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Just pay attention to this particular statement. The strata are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Suppose the entire bunch of fish they constitute a particular number. Say they, if you add everything up, it comes to around 20. There are three categories. So when it is mutually exclusive, a particular fish cannot be repeated in more than one category, and if you add them up it will actually come to the exact number that we have already identified. So the elements are selected by using simple random sampling independently from each group. It is more efficient as compared to simple random sampling, as dividing the population into strata increases the representativeness of the sample. So there are two ways of conducting stratified random sampling. First is proportionate allocation, and the second is disproportionate allocation. So in proportionate allocation, what you do, you choose a proportion. Say the, as I told you in the first picture, the maximum number held from the blue color species. So proportionately I have chosen maximum number from blue. So I would say that okay, I will pick up say 20% of my sample from the blue, 10% from the green, and 15% from the green category, and 10% from the pink category. That's how I do it. uh, for I'm choosing it proportionately. Disproportionate, I will have the same amount for every category irrespective of their numbers. So there are two ways of doing stratified random sampling. The next is cluster sampling. You know, cluster sampling is used when a particular population is dispersed widely across a geographical region. This method allows one to divide the population into clusters and then select the clusters at random. Say, for example, you know, uh, if you look into a village scenario, you have different caste categories. ଆମର ସବୁ ସାହି ଥାଏ. This sahi, that sahi, କେଉଟ sahi, এটা brahmana sahi. We have these sahis. They constitute actually one cluster. Say for example, I am trying to pick up certain clusters I'm trying to take up a study on, say, the weaving community. So maybe I will pick up some Tonti Sahi, some weavers Sahi from each of these villages which are into this art of weaving. That constitutes a cluster. So maybe one cluster from this village, one cluster, say, from this block, or too many clusters, two or three clusters from a particular district. So I'm not, individually picking up these units for my sample. I am picking up the entire cluster. And whenever we take up a cluster sampling, normally it is followed by some other sampling process as well. We normally use a multi-stage sampling whenever we talk about cluster sampling. So you will see that in cluster sampling, the entire population is divided into various clusters in such a way that the elements within the cluster are heterogeneous. Just note my words. These clusters are divided and arranged in such a way that each element within the cluster are heterogeneous. What does it mean? Just, just give me a moment. Yeah. So when I say that in cluster the entire sampling is arranged in such a way that the clusters are heterogeneous in nature, it means that you know as I'm talking about the weaver community, I'm talking about the weavers, residing in a particular way, and in terms of clusters, you have a diverse, range of population here. uh, when I talk about this community, there could be people in that community who no longer are associated with this particular job. There could be people who are doing very well in this business, and they belong to a very high class community in terms of their income and expenditure. There could be people who are extremely poor when it comes to the class categories. So basically, when you talk about these kind of clusters, you will see that every element are heterogeneous in nature, and here you will actually feel that there is a kind of a homogeneity when I'm talking about the entire cluster, and there is a heterogeneity in the elements itself. So maybe they belong to one caste community, but at the same time, you have to be aware of this fact that every caste community is so very diverse, be it in terms of their class elements, be it in terms of their income and expenditure patterns, in terms of their gender processes, in terms of their lifestyles, the standard of livings, everything would vary. So that makes this community completely heterogeneous. So there is homogeneity between the clusters. It is considered to be opposite of stratified sampling design. Cluster sampling is useful when populations under a survey is widely dispersed, and drawing simple random sampling may not be practical. Just give me a moment. I'm just having these disturbances because my phone is attached to my mobile. Let me just disconnect it. Sorry. Well, so what I'm trying to say that these cluster samplings, there is a homogeneity between the clusters. It is considered to be the opposite of stratified sampling design. And the cluster is useful when populations under a survey is widely dispersed and drawing simple random sampling may not be practical. So sometimes the applicability of cluster sampling in the organizational context is questioned most of the times, because we take cluster sampling, it is useful when the population is widely dispersed and you believe that there is some kind of homogeneity in that group. And in such cases, taking up simple random sampling may not be a practical idea. So in those cases, we talk about this kind of a sampling. But the applicability of cluster sampling when it comes to organizational research, it may not work out possibly in that context. Now, let's talk about non-probability sampling. Okay, before I do that, let's take a 10 to 12 minutes break. I'll get back to you after that.
Okay, ma'am.
Welcome back. We will continue with non-probability sampling. So when it comes to non-probability sampling, the first category that we deal with is convenience sampling. If you remember, yesterday we were discussing about exploratory research, and in exploratory research, normally, you are not, you do not have much information about your field, and you are just trying to collect some preliminary basic information. So exploratory research design is not the sole kind of design that you depend upon. It is followed by some other research design. So normally what you do when you are not familiar with the field, you are not aware, you do not have the basic information about your population, you tend to ask people who who have any contacts that they can get you connected to someone. you know that's called a kind of a convenience sample. So basically it is used in exploratory research where the investigator is interested in getting an inexpensive approximation of the fact. As the name implies, the sample is selected because it is convenient, also called haphazard or accidental sampling. Normally, it is meant for convenient, but at the same time, we believe it is not a completely scientific, procedure for selecting the sample. So we normally call it a haphazard or an accidental sample. So when it comes to convenience sampling, it is used to obtain information quickly and inexpensively, because you are just sitting around and you just pick up a phone and you give somebody a call you are acquainted with, and you try to get some basic information. So basically you do not expend neither much money nor resource nor energy into it. You try to get at hand at things that you can quickly lay your hands on. So it is used in a pre-test phase of research, such as pre-testing the questionnaire. Here sampling unit may either be self-selected or selected because of the ease of availability. No effort is made to choose representative sample. It is not possible to make an estimate of sampling error in this case, so not suitable for descriptive or causal research. So since it is a quasi scientific kind of a sampling technique, of this kind of a process, when we are using say experimental research design or descriptive design, or say for that matter diagnostic design, where we are looking for causality. In cases where you look for causality, we abstain from using these kind of sampling techniques. Generally we use it for exploratory research. Judgment sampling: the researcher selects the sample based on judgment. This is usually an extension of convenience sampling. The researcher targets a group of people believed to be typical or average, or a group specifically picked for some unique purpose. So, it is also called purposive sampling, where you use your judgment. For example, I will say that I need to interview some of the best singers of the state, or I need to interview some of the singers who are present in the classroom. So for that, I cannot just go for a lottery method or any other method. I'll have to ask them who can sing, who has a passion for singing, who has that skill and technique, and accordingly I'll choose. So the researcher here is making use of his or her own judgment to select the sample size. That's the reason it is called judgmental sampling. In case of judgment of an expert is used to identify a representative sampling. Normally, you know when I fail to have an idea on a particular thing, I will try to seek an expert that these are the things, these are the criteria I have. Could you just come as an expert and help me select my sample? So normally I do that with the help of an expert who helps me in identifying a representative sample. It is used when the required information is possessed by limited number of people. Generalization may not be possible, but it is helpful when one needs to the insights of opinion leaders and experts in a given field. So normally, I seek the help of opinion leaders, experts in a given field, and I take their views, and then I go about selecting my sample size. Then there is another non-probability sampling that you call snowball sampling. In this method, what you do when there is a desired sample characteristic is needed and you believe that it is rare, you do not get to see them often, or it is very difficult to identify them. So it may be extremely difficult or cost prohibitive to locate these respondents in these situations. So snowball sampling relies on referrals from initial subjects to generate additional subjects. Basically, you have, you know, say, I want to interview some of the transgenders. It might not be rare, but I really don't know how do I come across them. So maybe I can ask any of my acquaintances who can introduce any one of them to me, and in turn that same person can introduce me to some of his or her friend, and then I would ask the second respondent to introduce me to somebody else. So like this I will go on till I get the ultimate sample size for myself. This is called snowball sampling. So, in snowball sampling, it relies on referrals from initial subjects to generate additional subjects. Desired population. Under this design, each respondent, after being interviewed, is asked to identify one or more in the field. Next is quota sampling. So, what do you do in a quota sampling? Uh, as I told you earlier, it is again a non-probability equivalent of stratified sampling. Like stratified sampling, the researcher first identifies the strata and their proportion in the population. Then convenience or judgment is used to select the required number of subjects from each of the strata. So basically, you use your judgment. There are certain required number of subjects, and you tend to choose that category, and then you from that very category you use some kind of convenience or judgment sample to select the sample units. This is what we call quota sampling. So that's how we have come to an end of our topic on sampling. We still have time, so I think I will start this section on validity, the concept of validity, which is equally important when we talk about research designs. Just let me introduce you with the slides first. Just give me 1 minute. Just prompt me if you are able to see the slides. So, normally we discuss about this concept called validity. When you say that how valid is your research, you know, we keep talking about validity and reliability as two interchange know concepts that we mostly talk about. But what do we mean by validity? Are we talking about the validity of the research process? Are we talking about the validity of the data? It's the validity of the instrument. What is it actually? Anyone who can answer? No? Give it a try. Basically, when we talk about validity, validity is the property of a research instrument. So, what is a research instrument on your part? What constitutes a research instrument? Or the research tools that you use?
Survey questionnaire.
Very good. So, when we talk about validity, we are actually talking about the research instruments or the tools, which could be your questionnaire, your interview schedule, or your interview guide. And validity is that property of your tool which measures, number one, the relevance, number two, the precision, number three, the accuracy of the instrument. So, validity is not about data, it is not about the data being valid, it is about the instrument, the measuring instrument being valid. The first point is relevance, as I told you. So, basically, when we talk about validity, it tells the researcher whether an instrument measures what it is supposed to measure and whether the measurement is accurate and precise. These are the things that follow. But the first thing that you need to ensure is the relevance of that instrument. Relevance means you are using a thermometer to measure temperature and not a barometer. You have to think in terms of using the appropriate tool for your particular research. For scientific studies, they have these standard tools. They have this thermometer, the barometer, they have the heat screen, they have different categories of tools. But when it comes to social sciences, we have these tools like questionnaire, interview schedule, interview guide, and every time you have to create your own tool. That's the basic difference between scientific and social science. Researchers are equally scientific, but when I say scientific, I mean researches done in natural sciences. They have a already, pre-approved, a already available instrument. But every time you go to the field, you have to create your own research instrument. So for creating your own research instrument, you should be aware of the fact that you are asking the right question for the right problem. I have a certain kind of a problem, but my questions are directed, something around it. I'm just beating around the bush, and maybe the questions are not pinpointed towards my research question or my research problem. So, in that case, I can say that my instrument was actually not relevant. You know, I should have asked this, or I should have, uh, I should have added these things in my instrument. So that is about relevance. It is a measure of the quality of the process of measurement. In quantitative research, it asks the question, do the instruments or indicators measure what they are supposed to measure? They are supposed to, as I told you, I'm supposed to measure temperature with a thermometer. But am I using a barometer or some other equipment to use temperature, to measure temperature? So the basic question that a quantitative in quantitative research you ask is, do the instruments measure what they are supposed to measure? It doesn't appear relevant when I say that you are using thermometer instead of barometer. It might sound like an act of stupidity, but it is extremely significant to ask this question in social sciences, because every time you have to create your own instrument, and when you are creating your own instrument, sometimes you miss out on things. You miss out on the appropriate question, that okay, this kind of a thing has arisen, I have this kind of a problem. What is the relevant question that needs to be asked, so that I can receive a relevant answer from my respondents? So that is about the very first step of validity. And you have to keep in mind that every time you are using it, you are trying to ask, are your instruments relevant to measure the problem that you have taken into account? So basically that happens in a quantitative kind of a research. So as I told you, there are three important characteristics, that defining characteristics for the concept of validity. An instrument is considered to have absolute validity when it measures what it is supposed to measure and nothing else. For example, a scale of kilos is a relevant instrument when measuring a person's weight, but not for measuring one's IQ. When you are trying to measure somebody's IQ, you cannot use a weighing machine. You can use a weighing machine only for measuring somebody's weight. So that is the relevance of the instrument. Second point, validity entails a degree of accuracy. How accurate your instrument, your measuring instrument is. After relevance, you have to ask certain questions about accuracy. It refers to the ability to identify the true value of the item in questions. For example, you step on the scales, your weight, which shows 60 kgs, that is your real weight, but the scale would have an inaccurate reading and it would show 58 kgs. So that means my instrument doesn't have accuracy. So, you know, when we talk about validity, we have to make sure that all these points are important: relevance, accuracy, and precision. Relevance is picking up the right instrument for the right kind of research problem. Accuracy is trying to get the correct readings for the problems that you have identified. And now the third point is precision. Validity requires a measure or an instrument to be extremely precise as far as its measurements are concerned. Precision implies accuracy and at the same time requires that measurements employ smallest possible measure, very smallest possible measure. I will say that what kind of weighing machine are you using, a manual or an electronic, which is more precise? Manual weighing machine is more precise, or an electronic weighing machine is more precise?
Electronic, ma'am.
Sorry.
Electronic.
Very good. Electronic. Why? Because it can give you in decimals also. Suppose you have put on 50 grams more weight, it will give you the precise result. So that's the reason you might have heard of the recent case of Vignesh Phogat, who got disqualified in the Olympics because she was just 100 grams more than the required weight limit. So basically, you will see that sport dietitians, they keep an eye even on the fraction figures of weight gain or loss per week or per day. I mean, they keep track of everything. What is your weight in the morning? What is your weight in the evening? Even if it is 5 grams, 10 grams, they have to keep an accurate reading of it, so that they will control and they will monitor your diet. What was the diet that is adding more weight? What was the diet that is affecting you in a better way? So they have to keep track of it. So precision implies accuracy and at the same time requires that the measurement employ smallest possible measures, every smallest possible measures. So validity is about relevance, that is picking up the correct instrument. Second is measurement, that is that talks about the accuracy you have. Are you giving, is that instrument that you have picked up, that relevant instrument, giving the right result? And third is precision, how precise the results of that instrument is. So the more precise it is, the more valid it is as an instrument. So as I said, the electronic weighing machine is more valid than a manual weighing machine. So when we talk about validity, it reflects on the quality of indicators and instruments. It refers to the ability to produce findings that are in agreement with theoretical or conceptual values. Validity always tries to answer whether an instrument or indicator measure what they are supposed to measure. You have to keep questioning it every time. Every time you form a questionnaire or an interview schedule, you have to keep asking this question to yourself, that whether my questionnaire is measuring what it is supposed to measure. Am I asking the right kind of question, or somehow I have missed out on these things? I have to reframe my questions in a separate different way. I have to put this question to myself again and again. Now, how do I test validity? Whether my instrument is valid or not, how do I test it? As I told you, in scientific method, it is more objective and more clear when it comes to testing validity, because they have a protocol and at the same time they have fixed tools and instruments. As I told you, you will pick up a thermometer for measuring temperature, you'll pick up a barometer for measuring pressure. Uh, Say for you have these instruments for measuring rain. For every there are different instruments for measuring all kinds of physical phenomena. And at the same time, these instruments, they have a very clear reading. They will give you not only the accuracy, at the same time they will tell you about the precisiveness of that instrument. That I will say that whether my thermometer is working or not, I'll try to use it on me, use it on you, and then I'll come to a conclusion that no, the temperature seems to be correct. I'll try to have certain conclusion. But when it comes to social sciences research, it's a bit difficult, and it's much more challenging than natural scientists' effort in arriving at the idea of validity as far as instruments are concerned. In quantitative research, there are two ways of checking the validity of an instrument. And when I say quantitative methods, basically I refer to quantitative methods used in social sciences. So the first one is empirical validation. Here, validity of a measure is checked against empirical evidence. If an instrument has produced results indicating that students involved in student union activities do better in their exams, and if this is supported by available data, the instrument in question has pragmatic validity. Got my point? Here, validity is checked against empirical evidence. As I told you, that instrument has produced result indicating that students involved in student union activities do better in their exams. There is already some kind of supported data on that particular theme, and it is supported by available data. The instrument in question has pragmatic validity. Pragmatic means practically you will go and see. I'll take up a survey and I'll see that okay, who all are active in student unionism, and what about their exam marks? No, they are doing pretty well. So I would say that okay, the previous study also said the same thing, and I am now in a position to come to a conclusion where I can do the same. So validity here is assumed if the findings are supported by already existing empirical data. There is an empirical data available. Say, I would say that this data is pretty old, it was 10 years old or 5 years old. I'll say okay, let me take up a survey using the same question and I'll try to test it right now. Okay, this is also called concurrent validity, where you are trying to test the empirical validity of that particular problem. If a new finding supports the prediction of a measure in question, the measurement is said to be valid. There is a new finding, and the new finding is trying to give a new kind of a prediction. So we will see that okay, these are the reasons why the answer remains same, or even if there is a variation in the result, you can say that okay, these are the reasons why we have a different answer, because maybe the circumstances has changed. 10 years ago, this used to be the scenario. Now this is the scenario. You are at least able to identify some of the variables that has caused these variances. For example, if a study found, you know, it has found eventual introduction of advanced statistics into social science degree would result in dropout of older students. And meanwhile, this prediction is supported by new findings. Thus, this measure has validity, isn't it? So, this is called predictive validity. I would say that uh, we have, according to NEP, a new syllabus coming up, and this has somehow made sociology more mathematical. They have introduced advanced statistics, advanced mathematical models, and more quantitative models in this course. So, the age old tradition that continued, that sociology is an easy discipline, anybody can read it and digest it, that will go away. And you make such a prediction, and then you go for this kind of a finding, and you will see that it has been proved to be correct. So in this scenario, it can be called to be predictive validity. Then the third form of validity is called theoretical validity. Here, validity of an instrument is ascertained through conceptual or theoretical concepts. This is undertaken when empirical validation is difficult or impossible. You know, I'm in a position where I cannot actually take up any kind of an empirical study right now. I cannot go to the field and conduct this kind of a study using a questionnaire or anything. I find it really impossible. So a measure is taken to have theoretical validity if its findings comply with theoretical principles of the discipline. There are several types of theoretical validity. One is face validity. If an instrument on the face of it measures what it is expected to measure. Say, for example, a questionnaire on sex discrimination has face validity if it refers to experiences on discrimination by people for being male or female. Thus, the standards of judgments are based on general theoretical standards and principles of the subject. I have read a paper on gender, so I know that these are the basis of gender discrimination, and based on what I have studied at the theoretical level, I will try to use the same logic to frame my questionnaire, and then I will see that, yeah, perhaps this kind of a study would prove to be correct, because you know I have tried to measure what I'm I am actually trying to do. So I'm trying to measure sex discrimination, and I have read all theories on sex discrimination. I have read all the variances as far as sex discrimination is concerned, and I have put them into my questionnaire. So I use the general theoretical subjects and principles of my subject to construct my questionnaire. In such a case, I call it a face validity. Content validity. What do I call a content validity? Content validity is a measure where it covers all dimensions of a research problem. I'll give you an example. For example, I will try to assess how religious you are as a person. So I will say that I will pick up 10 persons from first year IGNO sociology classes, and I will try to measure their religiosity. So what could be the possible indicators to assess your religiosity? Any one of you? How do you know a person is religious or not? How do I know?
Much he has involved in the religious activities.
Like,
Doing regular prayer,
very good, doing regular prayer. What else? He or she should be
reading
visiting the
religious,
temple or any church or any place of worship, isn't it? That could be one indicator. What else? What else
any
could be?
religious scriptures he is regularly reading.
Reading religious scriptures, very good. So now we have three indicators. But have we covered all? So I would say that, I have missed out on certain indicators. I will say that, okay, that person is extremely religious because he goes to the temple or the church at least 3 times a day. And he or she wakes up, at 3 o'clock in the morning, and takes a bath in the well of the temple. They use only the temple water to bathe themselves. They don't use any ordinary water. That is also, an indicator of religiosity. Then, I'll try to collect as many indicators possible in my questionnaire. So next time when I construct my questionnaire, I will go with that questionnaire and ask a person, okay, when you get up, what is the first thing you do, what kind of water you use, do you visit the temple, how many times you visit, what you go do in the temple, do you you know weave those flowers in with your own hands to offer to the god. Nije mala guna ki tame, how often do you read these religious texts or scriptures? I have so many questions, but what are the basic characteristics of a person who is actually on these spiritual lines? you know how much that person is engaged in violence, or how much I am reading religious script and scriptures, but do I follow them in my everyday life? I don't have that kind of a question. That, okay, if I'm really religious, I read that religious scripts, 2 times a day, or almost every morning. But do I follow them in my everyday life? I would say no. I'm just, I'm into this habit of reading. I read, Hanuman Chalisa, these many numbers. I read Ramayana every day. But do I follow the principles that I get from that? Maybe not, or maybe I have not included that important question in my questionnaire. So I can say that my questionnaire was somehow haphazard. It has not perhaps covered all dimensions of that research problem. So, if a researcher in a study of religiosity employs questionnaire that contains questions on, how many times in a week do you visit the church or the temple? How many times do you do? I'm just, bothered about the physicality. How many times you do puja at your home? So, my idea of religiosity has just been what I say, contained to rituals, rather than uh, getting to understand the essence of religion, as to what kind of a staunch practitioner of those religious ideas I am. Have I practiced those ideas? I'm silent about those. I haven't added any question on those dimensions. I'm just looking into the superficiality of this idea of religiosity, because I believe that going to church or reading that religious book is enough. So here I can say that my questionnaire doesn't have content validity, because it has not covered all the contents of conducting a proper study in that field. Then apart from that, you have internal validity. What is internal validity? It refers to the extent to which research design impacts on the research outcome. It refers to the extent to which research design impacts the research outcome. Is my design affecting my research outcome? It ensures that the findings of research have not been affected by the instruments or procedures. The procedures that I have taken up for conducting my research, is it affecting my research outcome in any way? If you remember, I don't know if you have attended my first class of research methodology. If you remember, I was talking about Hawthorne effect. Any of you? Because every time I see students get changing. Are you aware of this concept, Hawthorne effect? No? Okay. You know, Hawthorne was a researcher like any of us, and he wanted to pick up a study on productivity of workers, efficiency and productivity of workers. And he chose the GE company, the General Electrical Company, to conduct his study. And he took, the all those ethical permissions from the employers, and he followed all protocols. And it was announced to told rather each of these workers, they were informed about this fact that somebody is coming to study, have a study on you. So what happened when Hawthorne arrived in that factory, and he stayed there for few days. In those few days, the productivity of the company got enhanced by 3 or 4 times. If they're producing normally, 100 pieces per day, when Hawthorne was present, they started producing 500 pieces per day. What was the reason? The reason was that these workers thought that somebody is out there to study us, and they started working very hard and efficiently to impress him, to impress the researcher. And when at the end of the day he started comparing with the previous results, and regarding productivity, and after leaving the field also, when he started asking about the scenario of productivity, he was completely astonished that within, it was only within for those period while he was present, that the productivity got escalated like this 4 times or 5 times. That has never happened prior to this. So we call it the Hawthorne effect. So basically what happens, it is it was the research procedure and perhaps his instrument that was affecting the entire research finding. So had he not taken an you know account of the previous results and the result after he left, he would have gone with the impression that the productivity of the uh, workers are 500 times more than what it is reported. And perhaps there is some flaws that lies with the employer or something that is taking up. So you have to be extremely critical about things when you take up such studies. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that internal validity is about the very taking into account the very research procedures, your instrument, your entire presence as a researcher, is it affecting the entire outcome of your research in any way? That we have to understand. So in such a scenario, we can say that perhaps there has been a loss of internal validity in my research process. Got it? So here we need to ensure that all are a result of an independent variable. If you remember in the last class, I was talking about EV or extraneous variable. What is this extraneous variable? I was just talking about it yesterday. Any of you? Give it a try. No? Basically, extraneous variables are those variables which affect our study without our knowledge. So, when I'm talking about internal validity, I should ensure that the results that I have got, it is just a result of that independent variable that I have come to measure, that I am measuring in the process of research. And when I'm talking about any kind of invisible extraneous variable that I'm not aware of it, I cannot talk about it because I'm not aware of it. So there could be certain things that would be affecting my study, but somehow I am missing out on those things. The way Hawthorne was, Hawthorne was not aware that it is his presence that is affecting his own study, that is affecting the idea of productivity. Actually, in that case, he was the EV, the extraneous variable, and he thought that okay, this is the productivity, it is so great, and they are working so hard, and perhaps the employer doesn't recognize this thing. So basically, it was the Hawthorne himself was the EV. So as a researcher, you have to ensure that the internal validity of your instrument is intact only when you take into account the independent variables. You have to keep your eyes and ears open, to sense that other variable which are affecting my entire scenario without my knowledge. You have to be very alert, and you have to have a very critical mind and keep thinking that is it something else, is it just what I see which is visible to my naked eyes, or there is something else that I'm not able to gauze and see, and nobody else is also able to see. And that's the reason why we take so much care in constructing a very good research design, in looking into every aspect of it. When you are constructing a instrument, you have to be extremely, you have to take care and take every precaution so that your study doesn't lose out on internal validity. So there are so many types of validity that we discussed today. Empirical validity, we started talking about theoretical validity, which again is of two types: your face validity and content validity, and then internal validity. So we have to ensure that we are rich in all different kinds of validity. So there are, we will continue with this particular slide maybe on Monday. Any questions till now? Any clarifications that you need?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Then I'll continue on Monday, and by the end of the session, I'll hand it over the slides to the organizers, and they will try to give it to you away in the group. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.